It was a time of prosperity and hope, a time of promise and expectation. When the robust presidential candidacy of Herbert Hoover began in 1928, America was riding waves of optimism and opportunity. The Republican Party even promoted the bold notion of eliminating poverty during the tenure of a Hoover presidency. Thanks to his unprecedented success in the mining business, his humanitarian leadership in response to World War I, and his 2 terms as Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover was among the most highly regarded men in America.
He seemed to fit the times in 28. Hoover was a landslide president. He had a mandate. He had a majority of people with him.
He had a sense of America as a special place in the world. He had a strong sense, if you will, of American exceptionalism.
He had more brains than most people, and he knew a lot more than most people about almost everything. And yet, that wasn't enough.
4 years later, the nation and the world were mired in the worst depression in modern history.
In 32, 4 years later, he couldn't have been more out of the times. He seemed to be a man from another century by then.
The great paradox of Herbert Hoover was that he had a reputation, a justifiable reputation, as being the great humanitarian for his work in World War I and for his work even as Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge. He understood how if businesses were prosperous, the families who were dependent on the breadwinners who worked for those businesses would be better. But he could not get into his head the notion that the federal government had a role to play in direct humanitarian aid to hard-stricken families.
Hoover is a real object lesson in the limitations of intelligence, experience, and even attentiveness in an effective president.
By the time Herbert Hoover ran for re-election in 1932, nearly a quarter of the nation's workforce was unemployed. Millions of Americans had lost their life savings. Entire communities were starving. And the farm economy was beyond the brink of disaster.
Now the battle must be continued. We have yet to go a long ways and to capture many positions to restore agriculture and employment. But it can be made plain that if the strategy which we have established is maintained, and the battle not halted by change in the midst of action, we shall win.
Herbert Hoover had an unprecedented reputation for managing crisis and tapping into America's voluntary spirit. Yet in the face of an agricultural crisis, a stock market collapse, massive unemployment, and the failure of the international banking system, Herbert Hoover lost the confidence of the American people.
Hoover was living in London in August of 1914. That was the world capital of mining finance. It was where he had his offices. The war broke out on the Western Front when Germany went to war against France, with England joining in. Germany was looking for a decisive victory, went through Belgium. The quick war turned into the trench war. Belgium was cut off. The Belgians began to face severe food shortages, first in Brussels and then throughout the country. In this totally unexpected way, he had an opportunity to be of service. The potential human tragedy was a part of what affected him. On October 22, 1914, Hoover and several other American engineers created what became known as the Commission for Relief in Belgium, or CRB, and it had the unofficial patronage of the American ambassador.
There were millions who were starving, and Hoover organized a tremendous relief effort. biggest the world had ever seen.
Hoover's solution? Feed the Belgians. Don't worry about the Germans. It was his own diplomacy. It wasn't the diplomacy of his government.
He was uninhibited by any sort of government structure. He was acting as an individual on his own.
He loved the belief of helping others. He really establishes the first international NGO, non-governmental organization, for humanitarian relief.
The Commission for Relief in Belgium was unique in the history of the world. There had never been an attempt to feed an entire country at war under enemy occupation by neutral representatives of a faraway country.
Prior to Herbert Hoover, prior to World War I, countries took care of themselves, and if they couldn't, their people starved.
He was feeding over 9 million people a day, pretty much from that point on, from early 1915 until the end of the war.
Among all of the major figures in World War I, only Herbert Hoover emerges from the war with his reputation enhanced. In 1920, both parties seek Herbert Hoover as a potential nominee for the office of President of the United States.
The Hoovers and the Roosevelts were friends starting in World War I. And Roosevelt actually wanted Hoover to run for president as a Democrat in 1920, and I am convinced that he wanted to be Hoover's running mate.
FDR himself actually wrote to a friend that our best bet would be to nominate Herbert Hoover.
Franklin Roosevelt goes to the home of Herbert Hoover on S Street and tries to convince him to declare himself a Democrat. And at that point, Roosevelt says he will run Hoover's campaign for president because he thinks so highly of this man, Hoover.
He, in some ways, is the actual kind of personality that F. Scott Fitzgerald was trying to write about in The Great Gatsby, somebody who comes out of obscurity and becomes a great world-commanding personality.
Herbert Hoover was born in West Branch, Iowa in 1874. He was the son of Quakers on the Iowa frontier.
He wasn't really a practicing Quaker over the course of his life, but his formation as a young man and his personality as an adult do reflect that Quaker background.
He was orphaned before he was 10 years old. At the age of 11, he was sent to Oregon to live with a maternal uncle.
He had no means, no family behind him, no inheritance, no nothing. You can only imagine how lonely and frightened and insecure this kid must have felt. And yet he becomes this great self-confident personality.
He was able to gain admission to the first entering class of Stanford University in the fall of 1891. He worked himself through Stanford as a member of its pioneer class, its first four-year graduating class.
At a very young age, he was a multimillionaire and a very successful mining engineer in Australia and China.
The Herbert Hoover you love best is the Hoover who was Hoover before he was president. The Hoover who was the most successful young man of his generation, a mining engineer at a time when mining was where the wealth was.
The will to achieve was exceptionally strong in him, and that the first way that that took shape was to be a financial success in the world of mining, engineering, and finance.
Luck then came to people who knew how to get commodities out of the ground. He got gold out of places where people thought you couldn't get any gold anymore. He built up this field that was so important to the world economy.
And he once said later in life that his objective in life was to be not dependent upon anyone. So from his engineering profession, from his Quaker background, from his orphanhood, and from his Stanford experiences and educational philosophy that he imbibed from Stanford, one sees the making of a super achiever.
He became so well known in America that his last name becomes a verb, to hooverize, meaning to help find food for people in need.
People felt like he could do anything. When he decides he's a Republican, he goes into the administrations of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge as Secretary of Commerce. And he takes the Commerce Department from a kind of a backwater and he makes it the center of the action in Washington.
Now, why did he want that? Because I think Hoover liked public life. He liked public service. He had the taste of the possibility of becoming President of the United States in 1920. And I do believe that at some point along in there, at the end of World War I, Hoover conceived the ambition of wanting to be President of the United States.
Hoover is not credited enough with what he accomplished as Secretary of Commerce. Among the best secretaries of commerce ever in history, in terms of bringing the American economy into the 20th century.
We have a Commerce Department that basically says government has a role at the table of industry and improving standards. We're going to have federal highway standards. We're going to regulate traffic by having something called a traffic signal. We're going to have road signs that'll help people get across the country. We're going to regulate radio waves to make sure that people get clear signals. We're going to have the school lunch programs. We're going to have lots of things that are going to make life better.
He was involved in railroad regulation, the regulation of the nascent airline industry, waterway development, regulation of products, standardization of products, of industrial waste, and conservation. You name it, Hoover was there. He almost was the undersecretary of every other department. Now that made him something of a bureaucratic imperialist.
It was also a decade of great prosperity and great technology. In 1920, only 60,000 American homes had radios. By 1930, 9 million homes have radios. People are buying radios before they even have electricity in their homes. They're buying automobiles. It allows them to travel the country if they choose.
The 20s were a decade rather like the 1990s. The growth kept reaffirming the importance of business.
It's also an era when we have a tremendous amount of disposable income, so people can buy labor-saving devices like vacuum sweepers. Once they get electricity in major American cities, it changes the nature of work.
He did not want to use government for the purposes of, shall we say, socialistic direction, top-down, with the state absorbing social and economic energy. He really wanted to stimulate the private sector to organize and govern itself.
He thought this is really where, this is the realm of freedom, this is the realm of liberty, this is the realm of energy and entrepreneurship and opportunity and so on. It's not government that provides these things. Government can protect them and create situations in which they can flourish, but the real life of the society resides in the health of civil society as distinguished from politics.
He said that the essence of American individualism was a belief in equality of opportunity. He said this was the touchstone of our entire social philosophy, the fair chance of Abraham Lincoln.
So he wrote this little book. And in many ways, it's a kind of a restatement of a Jeffersonian philosophy.
There was something special in the U.S. that had to be protected, and he called it American individualism. And what he says is individualism is this building block for progress.
It finds the distinctiveness of American culture and society in the vitality of what political theorists would call civil society, not in the genius of government or in the structure of government itself.
I don't think that Herbert Hoover would say the solution is empower a group of people to tell others what to do. He would say, find a way to structure a government so that you can empower individuals constructively towards their betterment. was really the 1927 Mississippi River flood and the way he handled it that propelled him to the national spotlight.
It refurbished his humanitarian credentials. It was very well timed for him politically.
This was the disaster that preceded both the Dust Bowl and Hurricane Katrina.
Rainfall in the upper Mississippi River watershed filtered down to the lower Mississippi and flooded vast areas, very poor parts of the nation in Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana. Up until that time, all calamities of that sort, even regional calamities, had been addressed locally or by regions, by states.
It wasn't seen as a federal responsibility to those people in trouble. Indeed, until FDR, if you were in trouble, it would be nice if people like Herbert Hoover came to your assistance, but there was no requirement that they come to your assistance.
And this was the Katrina of the 20th century. Nothing like this had ever happened, and look at the difference between how these two situations were handled. An individual took charge, went to the scene, set up tent cities, got food, got relief, organized it as sort of a guy on the ground orchestrating everything, versus what happened in Katrina.
By the time of Hurricane Katrina, when the Bush administration didn't respond quickly enough, even the most conservative Americans didn't say, it's none of Washington's business if people are drowning and starving in New Orleans. And that's something that changed with the New Deal.
What Hoover mostly did, and Coolidge did too, and they went on the radio and did this, in fact, was to appeal for money from the charitable free will donations of the American people, and raised many $1 million. In fact, it was quite successful in dollar terms.
Hoover basically helped to pioneer the idea of large-scale rescue and relief. These were tremendous feats of organization and humanitarian leadership.
900,000 people had to be housed and fed for months at a time until the flooding could be addressed and the water could recede.
A number of the Democrats in the South, with Franklin Roosevelt helping to lead the charge, Roosevelt was then out of office, argued that this was far too big an emergency to be handled by traditional mechanisms. Hoover saw this as a reaffirmation of American individualism, although he was willing, I think, more than Coolidge, less than Roosevelt, to involve the federal government in certain kinds of Reconstruction measures.
And so he got enormous press, popular press. And because it did focus on his achievement and his particular style of leadership, and it did hearken back to what happened in World War I, it propelled his candidacy forward. Coolidge referred to him as the Wonder Boy. So there was a fair amount of animosity, I think, within the Republican political establishment to this fellow Hoover, whose ideas seemed to wander off the Republican agenda from time to time, who didn't have any specific loyalties to any Republican political machine. What's he going to do next? But it was hard to deny him.
There was this issue, who would succeed Coolidge? Would Coolidge run again in 28? Would Hoover have a turn? Hoover made himself famous with this flood.
Herbert Hoover had established himself as a great humanitarian, a great Secretary of Commerce. He was in the middle of everything that the Coolidge administration had done. So by the time of the 28 election, he was the natural.
He had a highly unusual career path to the presidency. He never had elective office or military experience. Here was the man who fed the Belgians, a man who could present himself as an executive, as a doer, as a humanitarian, as an engineer. His career up until 1928 was an unbroken trajectory of success.
It was like having Bill Gates run for president, or having Steve Jobs, even more, run for president. That guy who has that thing the government envies and the private sector has, that was Hoover.
There's been no presidential candidate since, to my mind, whose principal claim on our political attention has been just his sheer, unqualified competency. That was Hoover's great signature characteristic as a presidential candidate in 1928, and I don't think we've seen the likes of it since.
He was enormously popular among the college students and college professors of America. We could appeal to independents and some Democrats as a kind of untainted, good government Republican. He was a Protestant in a campaign where the Democrats had nominated the first Roman Catholic, Al Smith, to run for president.
He was used to being the smartest guy and used to everyone following him, and used to serious amounts of adulation. So he thought it made sense that he should be president, and one could argue it did make sense. Coolidge himself had said the business of America is business.
But he won big. It was a landslide. Smith was a flawed candidate, and Hoover seemed to fit the times.
Herbert Hoover won the election of 1928, partly because Smith was Catholic, but Smith was very popular. I think Hoover won in a landslide because he was so well known and so popular himself.
I ask the help of Almighty God.
Had the Democrats nominated virtually anybody else, Hoover would still have won. Hoover was just a commanding figure at that time. It's worth remembering that roughly half of the country was still rural, and the agricultural sector was still a very, very important sector. It accounted for maybe a quarter of all gross domestic product. Today it's about 2%. Even as late as the 1920s, about 80% of all the homes in the countryside had no indoor plumbing. Roughly a third to 45% of the entire population here, tens of millions of people. Virtually none had electricity. The agricultural sector had been depressed ever since the immediate post-World War I era.
There was prosperity for the rest of the economy, but part of that prosperity was almost at the expense of the farmers because commodities became so cheap.
There was an active agricultural depression going on in the late 1920s. It had to do with the price run-up, with prices going all the way up and then all the way down. The market had completely collapsed. They produced way too much. Wheat went as high as $4 a bushel, and then it went as low as a dime. And then it went to, they literally couldn't give it away.
The bad things that happened in the 30s were just foreshadowed for farmers in the 20s.
There was a speculative mania that was driving stock prices to unsustainable levels. Hoover was quite worried about it, and his worries turned out to have been quite justified.
The real question on October 29th, 1929, is Herbert Hoover is president of the United States, the stock market, there's a terrible panic. Is this the beginning of a long-term change in our economy? Is this a long-term economic collapse that is going to require a new way of governance? Without question, Hoover would have denied it at that point. Everyone in the nation was in denial.
I think he really did believe that while there was a financial mess to be cleared up in Wall Street, that the larger economy was fundamentally sound.
Within 7 months of his taking office, you had the stock market crash, and then everything just kept going down, down, down. Agriculture started to go down, and that pulled down the local banking structure.
Most local banks were not directly invested in the stock market. Most of the runs on the local banks occurred because people were simply afraid. They were frightened. They had lost confidence.
When you knocked out the source of capital in all these small communities in an economy that was still 50% agricultural, it made it very hard to come back. Hoover did not sit on his hands after the stock market crash. The idea that he was a do-nothing president is wrong. The problem was that he didn't do enough. People lost everything. There were a lot of Harvard to homeless stories. It wasn't just poor people who got poorer. People cascaded all the way down through the system. If you were old with no Social Security, you were poor. If you just were a regular person and you happened to put your money into one of the 10,000 banks that went under, you were done. No deposit insurance.
I have some news for you, folks. I was just talking to old man Potter, and he's guaranteed cash payments to the bank. The bank's going to reopen next week.
But, George, I got my money here. Did he guarantee this place?
Go to the bank, just like in the movies. They pull down the shade. Sorry, your money's gone. You're out of luck. That's life. That happened to millions and millions of people.
The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others.
The banks were not backed by anything. So when the farmer went to get his money out of the bank, there was nothing there.
This was a really deep, awful crisis that blighted millions upon millions of households. The most human face of the onsetting depression, of course, was the unemployment situation, people going jobless. And unemployment eventually mounts to truly catastrophic proportions. By 1932, the last full year of Hoover's presidency, we think there were 25% of the workforce was unemployed. Very, very few married women worked. So 25% unemployment meant effectively that 25% of all households, not just all workers, were without wage income.
It really was a character test for Herbert Hoover that he failed.
He doesn't want to create institutions that will permanently encroach upon the robust vitality of civil society. So creating a permanent welfare class, a class that is long-term dependent on federal largesse for its daily bread, is something that he just fights shy of.
He really did not want to abandon his belief that the American people could help one another. It was almost in his fiber, in his bone. And I can't tell you why he clung to this so dearly in the face of a greater need to provide food to people and housing to people who clearly were living in shacks, were eating what they could.
He knew how to deal with the crisis. Here he's confronted with the greatest crisis that any American president has had since the Civil War, and he fails miserably.
When it came to people who were starving or families who were in need, Herbert Hoover assumed that individuals in communities, through their voluntary actions, would take care of each other. It was not the job of the federal government. It was almost as if he was lacking in imagination. He just couldn't see the possibility for the federal government to actually give humanitarian assistance directly to families in need.
He had very, very few tools or policy instruments. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not exist yet. The Federal Reserve Board had not fully evolved.
Can you imagine the fear? There was not unemployment insurance. There was not Social Security. There was not even a minimum wage. There was nothing. The federal government had no safety net, didn't even think in terms of safety nets. And suddenly everything started to crumble before your very eyes. You didn't understand it. Nobody was explaining it to you. Nobody understood it.
Hoover had it right in some fundamental sense, that the problem was not an American problem, it was a global problem.
The Great Crash did not exactly cause the Depression. It did have a huge negative effect on capital markets, because suddenly all of the people, and there were very few number of people who were invested in the stock market, but all the people who had been investing in the market, they had lost everything. He could have asked the Federal Reserve to perhaps expand the money supply. He could have increased federal spending, not worried about deficits. Fiscal and monetary policy would have been stimulative. They would have perhaps counteracted these fears that came from the virtual collapse of the capital market. But he didn't know enough to do that. No economist knew enough. John Maynard Keynes was still developing his theories. There was not the knowledge in the economic policy community that would have told Hoover what to do.
What caused the Depression to be a depression and not just a downturn or a routine crash was monetary policy. We thought we were in inflation and we were in deflation. The deflation was so severe that we literally ran out of money.
Hoover and the other institutions of government did exactly opposite what they should have done. They pulled money out. They didn't stimulate the economy, they counter-stimulated. They actually depressed the economy by cutting federal spending, by in a sense, indirectly reducing the money supply. Well, this all made things worse.
I remember he said in 1930, he said, this will be all behind us within 60 days. And when 60 days came, instead of 5 million people being out of work, suddenly there were 10 million people out of work.
By the end of 1931, it becomes compellingly obvious that these voluntary measures simply aren't going to work, and he has to move into an arena where he has to adopt measures that were ideologically a bit alien to him.
Should the state jump in? Should the federal system jump in? Should other banks jump in? Nobody quite knew, and that was one of the reasons the credit crises of the period were so bad.
Why would government be lending money? Now, today we say, of course, to stimulate the economy. But even the verb to stimulate the economy had not yet been invented.
So what did he do? He summons governors to Washington, D.C., and he asked them to accelerate any plans that they had on the shelf for new bridges and roads and buildings and so on as a way of pumping money and employment into the economy. He calls leading business people to the White House and urges them to maintain wage rates and to maintain payrolls, maintain employment as much as they could. But what neither he nor anybody else at the time could understand was that the crisis that was brewing was on a scale and to a depth that nobody had ever seen before. Many of his undertakings went in the direction of increasing the government's role, not just in this moment of crisis, but permanently, building permanent institutions that would give the government an ongoing role in the life of the economy and the society.
He established organizations like the National Institutes of Health and the Federal Farm Board and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, all to address America's needs.
Hoover was an early believer in what we would now call counter-cyclical economic planning, notably by public works expenditure. And so Hoover encouraged the states and saw to it that the federal government undertook a great deal of public works expenditure as a form of stimulus of the economy.
He spent more money than any other president before him on massive public works projects that were meant to jumpstart the economy. Projects that then hired workers to build dams, to build bridges, to build roads that would create lasting infrastructure for people to use that would help commerce.
Hoover eventually started giving money to the banks. He started giving money to small businesses. He started creating a lot of lending windows. Now, nobody in the federal government had ever done any of this before. This was all innovation. These were innovations that were taken up by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the New Deal. But Herbert Hoover did not give money directly to individuals. The very rich had money, but the very rich didn't need all the goods and services. That's what it means to be rich. You already have most of what you need. Exports could not nearly take up the slack. If you protect the American market from foreign competition, you are also reducing sales by American businesses abroad. You are increasing prices to all Americans of everything they purchase abroad. You couldn't do anything worse than the Smoot-Hawley Tariff.
The Smoot-Hawley Tariff episode is one of the really awful moments, I think, in Hoover's general political career. It enacts the highest tariffs, virtually the highest tariffs in all of American history. Makes it virtually impossible for foreign vendors to sell into the American market.
Notwithstanding the fact that over 1,000 economists wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, please don't sign this tariff. Bad things will happen, Mr. President, if you do sign the tariff, including professors from his own university, from Stanford, saying, please don't sign this. Hoover still signed it. So that's a bad one.
The Democrats, the low tariff party, immediately claimed that this was a huge policy error. And more recently, the devotees of supply-side economics and the policy outcomes that flow from that have argued that Hoover exacerbated the Depression, perhaps turned a recession into a depression by permitting the rates to go up.
And most economic historians looking back would agree that the what we today, I suppose, would call the siloing or stovepiping of all these various national economies really just absolutely struck the global economy a paralytic blow and it's what helps ensure the depth and duration of the Great Depression.
Came the Depression, and a movement built up in this country. Congress in 1924 had passed a form of compensation for the veterans of war. The thought was that this adjusted service certificate, or as it was popularly known, the bonus, would become available to them in 1945. A number of unemployed World War I veterans said, we're going to go and lobby for our bonus before 1945 because, frankly, the veterans needed the money now. The movement caught on. They started to come into Washington at the end of May, and the number of such people coming came to probably around 20 or 25,000. What they came to do was to lobby the Congress to allow the bill to be voted on. Well, Hoover took the position that this was economic insanity and that he would veto any such bill. The House of Representatives passed the bonus. The Senate voted overwhelmingly to reject the bonus. There was a kind of utopian hope on the part of the veterans that they could somehow, by hanging around, persuade the Congress to change its mind.
They were the emblem of the forgotten men because they had been promised a bonus for their service in World War I.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
Because 25% of the federal budget was going towards paying veterans, Hoover didn't think the federal budget could afford it. Meanwhile, you have thousands of people camping out on the banks of the Anacostia River.
Hoover didn't seem to care. And perception is not reality. Of course he cared, but I think he shut out the reality of their suffering and of the need for a return to growth of the economy.
Hoover was not unsympathetic to them as human beings. He thought their specific demand was fiscally unsound and irresponsible, and he thought that they should be cleared out of the buildings they were squatting in Washington, D.C.
He's calling out the army, and several names that we know now. Douglas MacArthur, Eisenhower was there, Patton was there. All three of them were involved in this cleanup of these rebel homeless men, the bonus marchers. It was brutal.
He had no time ordered the burning of their encampments. That was MacArthur's idea.
MacArthur was supposed to get the people out of the downtown area. He took a very expansive view of his authority. To MacArthur, the affected area seems to have been wherever any of these people had their camps.
Who knows why he allowed that to happen? He could have easily and accurately have laid the blame for this off onto MacArthur, but he didn't. Hoover took the blame for it.
What the bonus army did was it brought together the misery of the Depression with Hoover's inability to do anything about it, in fact, to do the wrong thing about it. I think if you'd ask Franklin Roosevelt when Hoover lost the election, he would say it was during the bonus army march.
Hoover decides to run again in 32 because he felt that he was on the right path. Yes, times were hard, but he had an unqualified belief that the programs and ideas that he was championing were going to work. And to some extent, that was true. What he didn't realize was how impatient the American people were.
It was the economy stupid in 1933. The economy stupid squared. The economy stupid to the third. It was a terrible economy.
People were desperate for somebody, and Hoover was doomed.
He had become, by 1931 or so, one of the least popular presidents in all of American history then or since.
We talk about change now. We have no concept of the scale of change that people saw at that time.
Franklin D. Roosevelt promised change. Franklin D. Roosevelt was charismatic. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a new face. Franklin D. Roosevelt promised that it was possible that happy days were here again, and the public looked at where it was and said to Herbert Hoover, "I'm sorry, you're fired."
Now it was a Katrina moment. It was a moment where people said, all bets are off, we're dying, save us. Let's forget about all the economic philosophy. The fact that he had been Mr. Rescuer before all this made them all the more bitter against him.
He's a defensive president at that point, and he just didn't want to believe that the American people would abandon the man who had saved Europe. He felt he had earned the right to a second term. In spite of his paraplegia, Roosevelt flew to the Democratic National Convention to accept the nomination in person, a first. He seemed vigorous.
This is more than a political campaign.
Who was FDR? He was the governor of the state of New York, so he was the governor of the state with the most electoral votes. Definitely a winner. He was a powerhouse.
My concern in dealing with the problems of these times.
Hoover was reserved, he was quiet, he was analytical, he was not a gregarious personality. Roosevelt was just the opposite.
Hoover believed in voluntary efforts. Roosevelt believed in using the force of law and the power of the federal government to change people's lives. Those are two very fundamentally different ideas.
Roosevelt would enter a room with one set of ideas, and then he would find the people in the room had another set of ideas, and he would adjust. Hoover had much more trouble adjusting. The essential work of a politician is to take in what the people are saying. Roosevelt was able to do that, and Hoover was not.
And Roosevelt was thought to be sort of a lightweight, thought to be a dandy. But he transitioned himself into someone who was on the side of the forgotten man.
These unhappy times call for the building up of plans that rest upon the forgotten, the unorganized, but the indispensable units of economic power.
He basically said that the foundation of the American economy rests on the forgotten man. That was his term, at the bottom of the pyramid. By implication, Hoover backed the man at the top. Roosevelt, in some ways, ran to Hoover's right politically, criticized Hoover for daring to raise taxes, criticized Hoover for all this government spending, called Hoover a tax and spender.
Hoover didn't know that he was in trouble until the end of the 32 campaign. Remember, polling was only in its infancy then, and it wasn't until he literally was pelted with tomatoes at a campaign stop and realized that the response he was getting out there left something to be desired, that he fully understood that he could be headed for a cataclysmic defeat.
By the end of 32, it was clear that he couldn't change the dynamic, that he was not on the side of most Americans.
He had won in the greatest landslide, I think, up until that time, and lost in the greatest landslide the following term. But at the time, he felt that the people would stick with him, stick with Hoover.
This was considered to be the most critical turning point or transition in presidencies since the Civil War. In those days, the new president did not come in until March 4th. It was a longer interregnum than we have today. Hoover sought Roosevelt's cooperation. He invited Roosevelt to come to the White House.
When he first approached Roosevelt, he wanted Roosevelt to stipulate to 5 or 6 things in a joint statement. Roosevelt refused.
Hoover, I think, got it in his head that Roosevelt was being coy and uncooperative for base reasons. Roosevelt got it in his head that Hoover was trying to trap him in some way to curb his freedom of action. It basically became evident by January that Roosevelt was not going to do anything significant to advance what Hoover thought was the right policy dealing with these international economic issues.
Now, I would fault Hoover for not taking action at that point. He should have used what authority he had to declare a bank holiday or a bank moratorium, as he called it. And he would only do it if President-elect Roosevelt joined with him, and Roosevelt didn't want to have the responsibility when he wasn't president yet.
The crisis took another turn in mid-February when the banks in Michigan started to fall. And this became kind of the final push in the stack of dominoes leading to the complete closure of the American banking system.
They were basically talking, even arguing on the phone as late as 1 o'clock in the morning on the day of the inauguration. Unimaginable now, the outgoing and incoming president, talking about the banking crisis in very strained terms.
There's that famous photograph of them in the open limousine headed to the inaugural ceremony, and Roosevelt is beaming, and Hoover looks absolutely glum.
You have perhaps seen the films of Hoover essentially refusing to talk to Roosevelt as they share the inaugural parade car on the way from the White House over to the Capitol.
Hoover's glum. He looks terrible. He looks like a man who's just lost by one of the biggest landslides ever. Roosevelt looked like things are going to get better.
Things were so tense, they exchanged not a word in the car, except when Roosevelt looked up at the Commerce Building, ironic since Hoover had been Secretary of Commerce, that was under construction, and said, "Lovely steel." Those are the only 2 words they exchanged. Hoover said nothing.
If you want to interpret Hoover as conducting a 4-month campaign for Roosevelt's mind, Hoover lost the battle.
They went from being good friends to arch enemies to, after the March 4th, 1933 inauguration, never speaking to each other again, ever.
Most Americans believe that on the day Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated, the Depression ended. Why? Because Roosevelt gave them something Hoover couldn't give them, a sense of hope that better times will be coming.
The country desperately wanted a new leader and somebody who would experiment, who would just try things. Washington had never seen anything like it. It was like a tornado of activity. And much of it didn't work, but at least it was activity.
Many of the early programs of the New Deal, the first 100 days, are programs that Hoover had introduced in Congress but were being held up in committee by a Democratic Congress. So to some extent, we should give Hoover credit for some of the early days of the New Deal. But if Hoover were here with us, he would probably deny this because he had personal animosity toward Franklin Roosevelt and toward the whole philosophy of the New Deal.
There were a number of similarities, but there were also huge differences. And I think maybe the best way to understand that is to look at something like Social Security, which is something that Herbert Hoover did consider to be a total violation, not only of his personal political convictions, but of the Constitution.
Hoover got mad because nobody gave him credit. He also got mad because the New Deal was bigger government than we'd ever seen before. Because Hoover did achieve a lot of things in his life, and now all he was going to be was the man who was blamed for the Great Depression, wrongly.
What's Hoover's legacy? We'll never see him on a dollar bill. We'll never see him on a quarter. We'll never see him on any currency. Hoover will continue to fade.
The tendency in most historical accounts to demonize Hoover, to make him look ridiculous or ineffectual, are really going to the point of bolstering the reputation of the person who succeeded him, Franklin Roosevelt, by drawing the contrast between the incompetent and failed Hoover presidency and then the successful New Deal presidency. Now, I think that's a story that in some ways is true, but I think has been hugely exaggerated to the detriment of Hoover's own reputation and I think to the fidelity of the historical record.
He was a failed president, partly because he couldn't communicate very well, didn't have charisma, partly because he didn't give people money or aid or food directly, was not the humanitarian he could have been directly for the American people, partly because he and indeed nobody, even Roosevelt, understood how important it was for the government to be the spender of last resort, to just spend money on infrastructure, spend money on projects that needed to be spent on in order to get the economy going again.
After leaving office, Hoover played the role of Washington outsider until 1946. He retreated to family matters, spent some time fishing, and continued as trustee of his alma mater, Stanford University.
There was one drive behind Hoover during the next third of his life, and that was the drive for vindication. Hoover attempted to restore himself to the good graces of the American people by the writing of his 3 volumes of memoirs, by the Hoover Institution, which he later regarded as the most important thing he had done in his life.
When it came to politics, Hoover did not go quietly into the night. While many historians credit Hoover with a successful post-presidency, he did spend the remainder of the 1930s offering sharp and unprecedented criticism of his former challenger.
I have seen the insidious destruction of liberty by propaganda.
In 1935, he really hit the trail and became, for years, the most prominent critic of FDR. He was wearing a partisan hat as ex-president. At the same time, he was trying to transcend partisanship and restore his reputation.
He appears to be at least a spokesperson for unqualified laissez-faire and against all forms of government intervention in the economy and the society. It's not really the person he was as a young progressive in the teens and 20s and as president, at least in his first year or so in office.
The bombing of Pearl Harbor and outbreak of World War II brought the nation together in a common cause.
After Pearl Harbor, Hoover sent out some kind of signal that he was willing to serve in some nonpartisan capacity, and Roosevelt never invited him to do that.
Shortly after Roosevelt's death, and with Harry Truman assuming the presidency, Hoover was asked to return to the nation's capital. Truman tapped Hoover to reprise the role of his lifetime, this time helping the victims of World War II. As honorary chairman of the President's Famine Emergency Commission, Hoover flew to 38 countries to assist in providing food relief for millions of starving Europeans. Rejuvenated by his new role, Hoover participated in several civic functions, including the Hoover Commission, a bipartisan group challenged with reorganizing the executive branch of government.
He had kind of outlived his political enemies, and in his final years there was a certain avuncular image about him, and I think a lot of people felt that while they may not have agreed with Hoover, he had tried hard and was a decent and honorable man. Those were sentiments that were not so widely shared when he left office.
Herbert Hoover outlived his wife, Lou Henry, by more than 20 years. He died in 1964. Both Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry Hoover are buried near his birthplace in West Branch, Iowa.
Herbert Hoover was an extraordinary character. Even in my lifetime, my father was someone who, as a Republican, just despised Herbert Hoover. So he was one of those characters who had come into the Republican Party, and then because of the presidency and the Great Depression, it kind of dragged the party down.
It was a time of prosperity and hope, a time of promise and expectation.
So there was this effort to take a serious look at Hoover as a president and see what he did well and maybe what he failed at. Certainly not the worst president we've had, far from the best, but the complexity that he brought to the documentary, I think, was what made him the most interesting. And the archives are a big part of what makes that story come to life. What I think is most interesting about Hoover in this period is audio and video are not synced yet. And so a lot of the footage we have of Hoover is without sound. It's really not until the 40s that you start to see a lot of sync sound, late 30s. And so the archives that we used visually are compelling, but we had to create a lot of sound to go with them. In fact, I would say, really, if you tried to do biographies on presidents any time before Herbert Hoover, you'd run into almost entirely just still photos as a way to bring the story to life.
It was really the 1927 Mississippi River flood and the way he handled it that propelled him to the national spotlight.
Hoover was Secretary of Commerce at the time. He personally instituted the policies and the procedures to go in and help farmers and business owners along the Mississippi River in a way that really kind of set the table for the government infrastructure, the federal government infrastructure that follows. The second thing I'll mention about that particular flood is Hoover, to his credit, and much like what you might see from a candidate or a president today, had a film crew with him. And they documented almost everything that he and his subordinates were doing to try and mitigate the flood and deal with the humanitarian relief. It's about 40 minutes or so of amazing footage of that flood and the relief efforts that had never been seen before this film was made. What Hoover did was unprecedented. Today, it seems like standard operating procedure. In many ways, Hoover was the first truly international president. He was very well known in China. He was very well known in Western Europe. And really in World War I, he established himself as the great humanitarian because he was leading food security efforts and relief efforts for Western Europe during the fighting. So he was a man with a conscience. He was a man with empathy and compassion. It's really those things that wind up working almost against him in 1932, because when the Great Depression hits, he did the opposite of what we saw today during the pandemic, for example, where in the United States and much of Europe during the pandemic, there were stimulus programs to keep people fed, to keep people clothed, to keep people united in some kind of economic fashion, to keep the wheels of the economy turning. And Hoover, who had a humanitarian background during World War I, was unable to employ and institute those same kinds of policies in 1932 when the Great Depression hit. People are always looking for comparables. Who would he be like today? Well, in my opinion, he's very different from Donald Trump in most policy respects, but at the same time, he was a businessman, he was an outsider, and so at the point at which he comes into the presidency, as a Republican, he's radically changing the party in his own image. Now, had he succeeded in 32, things might have turned out differently, but in fact, he failed in 32. And, you know, there were a lot of Republicans literally for decades after that, who had a
particularly negative view of Herbert Hoover as someone who changed the party for the worse. To be fair, I don't think he fit any classic party kind of philosophy at the time that he ran. It was more convenient to run as a Republican. It was the party of business. He was a business guy. But unlike Trump, he had a fairly calm demeanor. He's not the kind of guy who would have been tweeting all day or the kind of guy who needed to see himself on camera. He was, relatively speaking, quiet and somewhat more introspective than someone like Trump, but both have had a major impact on their party.